Before I get into the next lesson, I wanted to talk a little bit about close reading and that reading assignment I gave you, All But the Waltz by Mary Clerman Blue. I gave you that assignment because Mary Clerman Blue, like most good writers, she makes her descriptions and her images do a lot of the work. Comes under the category show, don't tell. And so for good writers, and Mary Clerman Blue is a good writer, every time you have to describe something, a scene or a person or an object, it's an opportunity. Can I describe this sky in a way that not just tells you what the sky looked like, but advances the theme of the work that I'm working on? And Mary Clerman Blue did that. I tried to guide you into getting at what that essay is really about, what the topic really is about by the quotes I ask you to think about and write about. But most of you took them pretty literally. You thought when she was talking about the weather, she was talking about the weather. Well, she was talking about the weather, but the essay isn't an essay about Montana weather. It's an essay about her relationship with her father. And so when she talks about the weather, she's trying to push forward your understanding of that relationship. And she's using imagery because it's more interesting, it carries a lot of weight, but you can actually express things so subtle and complicated with the right images that if you tried to downshift into explainery, telling rather than showing, it would get really tedious. And it also probably wouldn't work very well. Let me give you a different example. I think you've probably all heard the poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, the entire poem, The Road Not Taken, is operating as a metaphor, and all I mean by that is he only talks about the road in the woods. But what he's really talking about is the way that we make decisions. Um, Even though he never mentions a decision, but the poem is about the road in the woods is a metaphor for how we come to present ourselves to each other, what decisions we make about our lives. And pretty much every time a good writer is thinking about a setting or an object, he's thinking also, or she's thinking also about what metaphorical possibilities there are with it. And some of this is just obvious. You see it all the time. I mean, a gray, rainy swamp, if that's the setting that the screenwriter or the poet or you, the story writer, places the story, you've given it all kinds of emotional baggage already that would have been quite different if you would have set the scene on a mountaintop in bright sunshine on a warm summer day. We know that I mean, this is done almost to the point of cliche. I mean, uh, if you have a scene at sunset, well, what's sunset? Sunset is one of those built-in metaphors of life. It has to do with the endings of things, things coming to a close, and also very beautiful. Sometimes the ending is the most beautiful part. Um, uh, I want you to think about that while you're doing your writing. I mean, if you're not reading Mary Clearman Blue the way she's writing, which is metaphorically, symbolically, uh, then you're probably not going to write that way yourself. Although if you don't pay attention to images and what they signify, you're leaving out the most fun part of writing, and you're also leaving out one of the most powerful parts of writing. And so let's go through Mary Clearman's Blues story a little bit more carefully, read some of the passages, um, and just talk a little bit about what you should have gotten when you were reading it, if you were really reading what she really was writing. So this is how she starts. On a warm Friday morning in September of 1983, my father climbed into his old red truck and drove away from the ranch in the foothills of Montana's Snowies. He was on his way to Roundup to haul home a load of coal, 70 miles there and 70 back. It was a trip he had made 2 or 3 times a year for 30 years. Okay, so far it all sounds very routine. You're just getting data information. Nothing surprising or startling has happened. But then look what she does. The weather had been dry and cloudless with all the endless false promises of fall in Montana. Endless false promises is pretty strong, emotionally laden words to talk about the weather and what false promises. That's a fairly negative emotion coming into here. And so at this point, you don't know what to make of it, but it should have gotten your attention. And then he goes on, and he would have driven out of the shade of pines. And that verb, would have driven. I mean, that tense of verb. I mean, normally this is just past tense. She would have said he drove out of the shade of pines, but she doesn't say that. She says he would have driven. Well, would have, that's the kind of language you use when you're speculating about something you can't find out. Why wouldn't you be able to find out what actually happened? I mean, the possibility at this point when I was reading, the possibility goes, oh, this is her dad's last day. He doesn't survive this. And I don't know that yet. It's just being suggested strongly by the language, false promises, something goes wrong. He would have driven out of the shade of pines. And then I notice this, with the sun at his back, soon out of sight. Okay, so there is sunshine, but he's got his back to it, meaning he's sort of facing darkness, meaning he's leaving, he's going away, soon out of sight of the sandstone ranch, the sawboard corrals, and the warm sorrel back of his favorite mare, Callie, gazing in the home pasture. Now that's an ominous beginning. And notice how she turned, it's a sunny, cloudless day, but she turns that into something negative, something vacant and empty, dry and cloudless with all the false promise. That's not a happy sunshine scene. And so, but what you do is you look for clues to see if what she's done here is intentional, if it's part of a pattern. And as you'll see, it very, very intentional, very much a part of the pattern. Reading closely like this is kind of a waste of time if you're reading a poorly written thing, you know, one of those novels you can buy at a drugstore or something. A lot of that reminds me of what Truman Capote said about a novel, On the Road, which didn't impress him. He said, that's not writing, that's typing. But a careful writer will pay off you paying attention to stuff like that. So let's see what the next quote I gave you was. And then you're starting to pick up some themes here. My sister and I knew nothing of this until much later. Although neither of us spoke it aloud, we both believed he had fallen asleep at the wheel and had rolled off the highway into some nameless brush-choked coulee. Now that's one of her early guesses at what's happened, but part of what you're kind of figuring out in here is what the essay is partly at least about, is Mary Clearman Blue is trying to find out, well, what did happen on that day? What did happen to my father? And what I was struck, a theme that runs all through this is neither of us spoke it aloud. Part of what this story is about is the way this family does not communicate. Why doesn't she know better about what was going on with her father? Because it's not the way their family works. All the way through, you'll see references to the fact that they don't talk about. They'll talk about the weather and they'll talk about sports probably, and they'll talk about the price of corn maybe. They'll talk about the work, but they won't talk about their emotional lives or their deeper feelings. And then she goes on, Jackie and I, going over and over this story, were relieved of our secret nightmares of the wrecked truck, the brushy gully, but we were perplexed by the direction and purpose of our father's odyssey. What did he think he was doing? And why? South Dakota? A man who had preferred all his life to remain within 20 miles of his birthplace? What was he doing? And so you've got something of a mystery going on here. I mean, it wasn't the case that their father was just going to town as he did many times. He turned the wrong way. He went too far, and he was a man of habits. Something is weird about this. And so it's creating some anxiety in the sisters, but it should be creating some anxiety in the reader too. It's a mystery. I mean, what happened? I mean, that's part of what Mary Clermont Blue has put in play. And then she gets into a long, this is actually the paragraph where she sets up that long flashback where she talks about her childhood with this man. But read it carefully. I mean, pay attention to the words. I often wondered whether his fiction reading, and she's talking about the fact that he read all of these Western novels, Zane Grey, Louis L'Amour, heroes, kind of cliches, pulp fiction, the kind of stuff I said you might find in the drugstore. Story after story after story, which just kind of models the idea of the code of the cowboy, the code of the West, strong, silent, competent, rides for the brand, all that stuff. But she goes on, but so strongly did he believe in a mythic Montana of the past. I mean, he's caught up in those stories and they kind of take the place of religion. It becomes the myth that organizes his life, a Western novel, a mythic Montana of the past, of inarticulate strength and honor and courage irrevocably lost, that I cannot escape the conviction that a conscious choice shaped the way he died. Man, if you missed that sentence, you kind of lost the thread of the story. She's saying here that he was caught up in a myth of the way the world was supposed to be or Montana was supposed to be, and a conscious choice shaped the way he died. That's getting real close to saying the word suicide, but if not suicide, then he put himself in a situation where it was likely he was going to die. But the main thing is it was conscious, a choice. He's doing this on purpose. Something happened on that day. And at this paragraph, then she jumps into that long flashback where most of the story happens about her relationship with her father growing up. And if by now you're caught up in the story, what you're going to look for when you read that is more information. Well, why would he have killed himself? What does this have to do with Mary Clermont Blue? What is her role in the story? And part of what she does, and this is a fairly standard technique in this kind of writing, is to pull out a photograph and to talk about it on the page. You can think about doing that in your story too. But she doesn't just look at the photograph, she tries to interpret it. A picture taken about this time shows the family on horseback in the big meadow below the ranch buildings. My father wears a light shirt, a dark vest, and chaps. Or is that chaps? His hat characteristically shades his face, obscuring it. But a cigarette juts white from the shadow in the tilt of his shoulders, the angle of his stirrups, his seat on his big strawberry roan mare, Sandy, are lines I would recognize instantly, anywhere, in my sleep. Beside him is my mother on Pardner, his top horse. My sister Betty and I, at ages 5 and 8, sit astride the gray ponies. Although it is a snapshot, it has the look of a posed photograph to enclose in letters to a family in the East. This is how we are. My mother has turned toward Betty, who is afraid of her pony, but my father faces the camera, self-aware. He knows he is a cowboy. And that's a major theme in this, that the cowboy is a mythic model, a role model. You can watch all those John Wayne or Gary Cooper movies if you've seen any of those, and they're not just entertainment, they're showing you a way to live your life. And he's one of them. If you're a cowboy, you are strong, you are silent, you get the job done. There's something heroic in it. And she goes on, this little 5-year-old girl, my heart pounded to think of my father with a contestant's number pinned to the back of his shirt, riding in front of the grandstand while the roar went up. My father riding in the grand entry with the stars and stripes rippling against the blue as the marshals rode the colors. The cowboys taking off their hats as the national anthem scratched on the loudspeaker. It seemed to me that the colors and the cheers had faded by the time I was born. My father was still glamorous, but now I was his only audience. And I think what she's trying to get across is just a sense of the glory and the grandeur of who this man was. I mean, he had been a widely recognized heroic figure when he was younger, but that last line, now I was his only audience. That's really important to think about. What is she saying there? This man, this great man, this strong man, he's reached a point in life where now I, his little girl, is his only audience. And then this, and then he lost us. That's the next thing she says. If you're making this out as a happy story about their beautiful childhood and she went on loving him forever, you didn't read it. He lost us. One by one, we finished high school and went away to the University of Montana. His plan was that we would become school teachers like our mother and grandmothers, and that we would find country schools near home to teach during the winters. We'd have a little cash income that way, and that we would live on the ranch during the summers and break horses and reclaim the hay meadows and even run a little stock again. But of course, we did no such thing. I mean, what you should be picking up right now is that life didn't turn out for this guy the way he wanted it all. He had a dream. It was centered on the ranch. It was centered on his family, but nobody shared the dream. They left. She was his only audience, and then she left too. And how was she feeling at this point in her life when she left the ranch and went away to college? What I felt for him was anger, that he had tried too hard to keep me tied to a tradition I saw as illusory. He had given everything he had for me. All I wanted was to be free of the cowboy. Can you hear that? I mean, if you didn't get any sense of family trouble and some guilt and some resentment, I mean, honestly, you didn't read the story that Mary Clearman wrote. Maybe you skimmed it, hoping that would be enough to do the assignment, but this isn't subtle. This is pretty direct. And then I ask you specifically to think about this image. She grew up with this man, so in her repertoire of things she could have put into this story, and this is a personal narrative like you're being asked to write, 50,000. I mean, if you tried to remember images of your family, I mean, your childhood, I mean, just start listing the things you could think of. I kind of ask you to do that because memory is associational. If I ask you what your 6th year of life was like, at first you might draw a blank, but if you think about it, you'll get something, and then you'll get another something. And once you start doing stuff, those things you remember will remind you of other things, and it's really rich. But my point is, this is an artistic choice to end with this image because she had dozens or hundreds or thousands of them should have. that she could have picked from. And what had happened, of course, was she was out riding her horse. She fell, and then when she looks up through the mist, she sees him there. He had ridden out to look for me. And I bolded that because I think that's the most important part. He had ridden out to look for me in his hat and chaps and spurs on partner, silent as a ghost through the gray curtain of rain. A white miasma rose from the creek behind him, and swallowed his horse. For a moment, I had to listen for sure, for the faint jingle of bridle chains, to be sure he really was there. And I think why that's interesting. I thought about that a lot because I'd be lying if I said the first time I read this, it all clicked clearly to me on a first reading. It didn't. I went back and asked myself pretty much questions, pretty much like the ones I asked you to think about. And I was thinking particularly about this image. Why did she pick it? And then eventually that line leaped out at me. He had ridden out to look for me. And then that changed my whole reading of the entire essay, because what I realized at that moment is the whole essay is the story of her going out to look for him. She senses in some way that he's been lost. She senses that he may be in trouble, and she really wants to find him. Who was her father really? What happened really? I mean, the whole essay is her searching for her father. And it's interesting that so far what she's talked about is the way that they're very different. He wanted this Montana ranching life. She wanted to be a writer and go to the university. And it was like he lost his daughter. But then in this moment, it's sort of like, but she is his daughter. She's like him. She does things the way he does them. And it's a recognition, I think, on her part. Certainly the idea that her father loved her and was worried about her is in there, and that when she really did need help, he would come looking for her, and she's reciprocating that. He really did need help, and she really is off looking for him. Of course, it raises the question of, can you help somebody who's no longer alive? And I won't try to get into that now. It gets fairly deep fairly quickly, except that I think you can. And if you want me to explain what I mean by that, I mean, call me and make an appointment. I'll come talk with you. And then this is the conclusion. When my cousin Willie told us the next day how he had found my father, I remembered how the mud had streaked my own legs. Notice what she's doing is she's seeing things, parallels between her and her father. And I wondered then, and wonder now, what did Willie really see that afternoon on a dirt road southeast of Miles City, or think he saw, or want us to believe he saw? None of us will ever know, not even Willie. The myth has its grip on us all. And that ending resonates because it means a whole bunch of things all at once. Willie is just like his dad, just like the whole dang family, and that he's not going to tell you. I mean, if he saw something really unpleasant, he's going to keep it to himself. We will never know because we don't really talk, because that cowboy myth has its grip on us all. But then at the same time, the cowboy grip, if the cowboy myth really does have a grip on her, if it really is part of her insides, if it really is part of who she is, then it isn't true in an absolute sense that her father ever lost her. She's still his daughter. I hope just seeing what Mary Clermont Blue is thinking about while she's writing will be helpful for you. I wish we had class every day because I'd like to spend a lot more time and look at a lot more examples of this. But I kind of hope you get the point. And this is fun. I mean, this is the fun part of writing. Every time, I mean, maybe part of your story, you're describing a pack of dogs chasing a car. Well, what do you want to happen at that point in your story? If you're talking about optimism and confidence and upbeat, you'll focus on that tough alpha male dog that's at the front of the pack, maybe ripping at the tire with his teeth, big, strong, moving fast. I mean, just happy at having a chase to be a part of. If you're dealing with depression or a sense of failure or loss, you might describe that same scene, but focus on the little dog that can't quite keep up, that's kind of huffing and puffing along at the back of the pack, trying to be a part of it all, but not really able to do it. Everything becomes part of your tool as a writer. The stripes on a highway, are they crisp and sharp and freshly painted and it looks like the world is in order and officially controlled and maintained? Or are they really worn and shabby looking? Or is some of it missing? Have there been potholes replaced blocking some of the stripes and they haven't repainted them? Or the worst example, I was in Phillipsburg a long time ago, and those two yellow lines that go down the middle of the street, the main street in Phillipsburg, they started wandering, got really unstable, quit being shaped, and then ran off to the side, ran off the road, bumped up onto the sidewalk, went over a couple of curbs, and then made a turn into an open door of a bar. I don't know why I'm telling you that, but uh, it's fun. I mean, trying to find the details that really do communicate what it is you're trying to communicate.